Assalamu alaikum. I'm Zafar Bangash. Welcome to Crescent International Commentary on Global Affairs. Today we are going to look at the issue of Islamophobia and the politics of fear, about which we organized a conference at the Islamic Society of York region on Saturday, May the 21st. We're going to show you some clips from that conference. And here is the first clip. I introduced the conference as well as the invited guest speakers. Now, as you know, we chose this topic, Islamophobia and the politics of fear, and I'm sure that you know that Islamophobia is now unfortunately rampant not only in North America but also across Europe, and Muslims are the new enemy. It seems as if the powers that be, instead of presenting something positive, something to bring people together, to unite them, they always want to scare people. And unfortunately, there are many people that can easily be scared because these are the kinds of tactics that politicians and other vested interest groups use in order to harness support for themselves. Ultimately, of course, this kind of fear-mongering turns out to be counterproductive, and it falls back on them. But regrettably, there are quite a few unscrupulous people in the world that play on these kinds of fears, and they don't want to allow an opportunity or space to create understandings. So what we plan to do this afternoon and this evening is to engage in that dialogue whereby we can explore ways of creating those bridges of understanding. True, we are not going to agree on everything with all the people, and yet it is important that we have a respectful dialogue with each other. We don't have to be enemies, even if we don't see eye to eye with each other. And so in that context, I believe that this afternoon's gathering is extremely important because the speakers that we have invited are people that have been actively engaged in this kind of a process. Our first speaker in the program was Dr. Scott Bader-Say, who is professor of Christian theology and moral ethics at the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. Dr. Scott Bader-Say dealt with the issue of fear and how it is exploited by various vested interest groups in order to advance their agenda. Here is a brief clip from Dr. Scott Bader-Say's speech.
How does the culture of fear shape us to respond as fearful people? And therefore, how does it shape us, for instance, to need that gun by our bedside? Do we need that gun by our bedside? And perhaps most importantly, what changes in us when we have the gun by our bedside? How does it change the way we react to the world or think about the world around us? As you can see from the title of the book, I came to these questions as a Christian theologian. And so today, I speak to you as someone who has reflected on these things primarily from within my own tradition, but also as someone who believes that there are enough significant overlaps within the Abrahamic traditions, that there are places where I hope my own reflections will resonate with your ways of thinking about and seeing the world and speaking of God, and that we will find places where there are analogies and overlaps in the ways that we respond to a culture of fear.
We had also invited Muazzam Beg, a British citizen and a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay, where he spent 3 years and then was released without charge, without trial, either in the US or in Guantanamo Bay or anywhere else. In fact, Muazzam has been going around speaking all over the world about the situation in Guantanamo Bay. Unfortunately, he was not allowed to board a flight to Canada. Although he was not told that he is inadmissible in Canada, Air Canada, on which he was booked for the flight, told him that they feared that if the flight were to stray over US airspace and the plane had to land in the United States, that there would be security concerns. And it was on this basis that Muazzam Beg was denied boarding on an Air Canada flight to Toronto. So we hooked up with him on Skype in order to at least get the message that he wanted to deliver. Here is Muazzam's message over Skype that he delivered to the conference.
The other man was the Syrian, was the person they said they sent to Syria. And he was, of course, I realized later, Mahar Arab. And he was tortured and beaten and abused and put in a coffin-like prison. And eventually, as you all know, he became one of the most celebrated, most notorious cases of what happened in the War on Terror to him. He was compensated eventually, and his name was cleared. The British prisoners here have raised a case against the British government for complicity in torture. Last year, we won a big out-of-court settlement, but the case continues in terms of the criminal case that we have pursued in the courts, and the British intelligence services, the equivalent of your CSIS, are now being investigated by the police. I'll say that again. The British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, are being investigated by the British police. That is like your Mounties interrogating or finding out and investigating criminally the acts of CSIS if they were involved in the torture and the abuse of their own citizens. And this, I think, is also one of the reasons why there is a fear that justice and the exposure to what has been taking place is something that we, as the former prisoners here, the former Guantanamo prisoners, have instituted and instigated. There was also a government-led inquiry ordered by the new British government under David Cameron into the actions of British intelligence into the abuse and torture in complicity against their own citizens. So all of this is part of the fight against Islamophobia, because the only way that we have to help to redress the situation is to say to people, we're not the terrorists, you are. And I don't mean this just to say words. I just want to tell you, in my mind, what is terrorism? Let's define terrorism. We're always being called terrorists. Let's define it. There are over 100 different definitions of terrorism, the word terrorism. But it first entered the English language, actually, from the French words, le grand terror, which was the great terror. And that was in the 18th century, when the French Revolution happened. The people who saw the Grand Terror were the ruling elite of Europe. And they said that these revolutionaries are bringing a terror, and that terror to them was democracy. Then this word changed, and it went through all sorts of metamorphoses up until the point today, where terrorism is described simply as an individual or organizations. But in fact, previous definitions of terrorism show how governments all across history were involved in the use of violence for the attainment of political and religious goals. And that includes governments today. If, and I clearly believe, the usage of indiscriminate bombings to kill innocent people is terrorism, which must be condemned, then what do you call the indiscriminate bombing, shooting, pillaging of millions of people across several countries?